The morning fog still clung to the fairgrounds when the old worker made his rounds, keys jingling on his belt out of habit more than need these days. He'd walked this same gravel path so many autumns that his boots knew where the ruts were before his eyes did. The duck pens sat at the far end, past the tractor exhibits and the empty 4-H barns, wood gone silver gray with age but still standing, still holding a few dozen ducks that paddled and dozed in the morning light. A boy stood at the fence, maybe 8 or 9, gripping the top rail with both hands, watching the ducks with the kind of stillness only children manage before the world teaches them to fidget. His family had wandered off toward the funnel cake stand, leaving him there, transfixed. "They're something, aren't they?" the old worker said, coming up slow so as not to startle him. The boy didn't turn right away. "Why do they look different from the ones at the store?" The worker leaned his forearms on the fence beside him, felt the familiar grain of the wood under his palms. He'd asked near the same question once, a lifetime ago, standing in almost this exact spot as a boy of 10 himself, watching an old man in a canvas jacket unload a crate from the bed of a rusted Ford. "These here come from a line that started with eggs nobody wanted," he said. "Cracked eggs, the kind you'd throw out without a second thought." The boy frowned, glancing between the worker's weathered face and the ducks paddling lazy circles in their pen. Cracked eggs don't hatch. That's what everybody figured too. The old worker's eyes drifted past the pens, past the fairground fence, out toward the hills where the county road curved off toward the old Denning place, though he didn't say the name yet. Some stories needed to be walked into slow, the way you'd ease into Cold Creek water instead of jumping. There was a woman ran the hatchery back then, sharp businesswoman. She had a crate of eggs the machines couldn't sell, hairline cracks in near every shell, the kind that meant nothing but rot and waste to anybody looking to turn a profit. So she threw them away? She meant to, but there was an old farmer in town, war veteran, quiet sort, drove the same beat-up truck for 20 years. She offered him that crate like she was doing him some kindness. Figured he'd either say no or waste a few weeks fussing over eggs that were never going to hatch anyway. He paused, watching the boy's attention sharpen, the way a good story always seemed to do to young ears. Whole town laughed when he hauled that crate home. Feed store crowd nearly fell off their stools. The boy's hands tightened on the rail. What happened? The old worker allowed himself the smallest smile, the kind that came from knowing exactly where a story was headed and enjoying every mile of the road to get there. "Well," he said, "that's the part worth telling." The feed store smelled like it always did that time of year. Burlap and molasses sweetener, a little diesel drifting in from the loading dock, coffee gone bitter on the warming plate by the register. He was there for a bag of scratch grain, nothing more, moving slow on that bad knee the way he always did on Tuesdays when the weather turned damp and his joints remembered things his mind tried to forget. She came through the door with a wooden crate balanced against her hip, moving like she had somewhere better to be, which she probably did. She ran her numbers the way some men ran cattle, tight, efficient, no room for sentiment. The hatchery under her charge turned out healthy ducklings by the hundreds every spring, clean rows of them under heat lamps, and anything that didn't fit the line got culled before it cost her money. She set the crate on the counter near him, not asking so much as informing. "These are yours if you want them," she said. "Cracked shells, every one. Machines wouldn't touch them, and I'm not wasting incubator space on maybes." She said it plain, no unkindness in her voice, just business, the way she'd talk about a broken axle or spoiled feed. "Figured somebody ought to get some use before they go in the bin. You're always fussing with something out there." He looked into the crate. 2 dozen eggs, maybe a few more, nested in straw gone yellow at the edges. Hairline fractures ran across most of the shells like old roads on a map. some so fine you had to tilt them to the light to catch the shine of the crack at all. The men at the counter had already turned to watch, the way men in small towns always turn toward anything that smelled like a joke waiting to happen. The feed store clerk leaned on his elbows. The auctioneer, still in his church clothes from some sale earlier that morning, let out a low whistle. "Ray," one of them said, "you sure you want to be hauling home garbage in that truck of yours? Might be the only thing holding it together." She didn't laugh with them, not exactly, but she didn't stop them either. She just watched him with the patient, faintly amused look of a woman who expected the crate to end up in a ditch by sundown, or forgotten behind the barn until the smell forced him to deal with it. To her mind, she was doing him a kindness, giving an old man something to fuss over, a task to fill his slow days, before she quietly finished the job the eggshells had already started. He didn't say much. He never did. He ran one thumb along the crate's rough edge, feeling the grain of the wood the way he might feel the stock of an old rifle, and looked at those cracked shells like a man reading a letter nobody else could translate. "I'll take them," he said. The laughter came easy after that, the way it does when men have already decided what a thing means before it's finished happening. One of the younger farmers, the one who'd bought his tractor new and liked to remind people of it, slapped the clerk's shoulder and said something about how the old man probably figured he'd hatch himself a duck dinner out of trash, save on groceries. Another said he'd heard the widower had taken to talking to his chickens now that there was nobody else left in that farmhouse to talk to, and wasn't this just more of the same? The words weren't cruel, not exactly, more the careless kind of mockery men trade when they've never had to make $40 last a month, when they've never had to learn what a person can do with what's broken because nothing whole was ever offered. He carried the crate out himself, refusing the clerk's half-hearted offer to help, cradling it against his chest, the way you'd carry something with a heartbeat in it rather than something already halfway to the compost pile. The truck's tailgate dropped with a groan that seemed to agree with everything they'd said about it. He set the crate down gentle in the bed, wedged it between a coil of fence wire and a bag of scratch feed, and took a length of old rope from behind the seat to lash it steady, checking the knot twice the way a man checks a knot when he doesn't trust the world to be kind to what's inside it. The auctioneer called out behind him, still grinning, asking if he planned to enter his garbage in the fair come summer, get himself a ribbon for best in trash. The younger farmers laughed harder at that, and even the clerk allowed himself a chuckle, shaking his head like he was witnessing something sad and a little precious, an old man's stubbornness dressed up as purpose. Only she stayed quiet, arms still crossed, watching the rope go tight around the crate, with an expression that had shifted somewhere between amusement and the faint unease of a person who has just realized the joke isn't landing the way she expected. He didn't look back at them. He climbed into the cab, the door groaning shut behind him with the same tired complaint it always gave, and the engine caught on the second try like it always did, coughing gray smoke into the cold morning air. He pulled out of the gravel lot slow, careful of every rut and pothole between the store and the county road, the way a man drives when he's carrying something he can't afford to lose twice. Behind him, the laughter carried a little longer than the truck did, drifting out over the parking lot until it thinned into the ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning: boots on gravel, a screen door swinging, someone's radio turned low. None of them watched him turn onto the road toward his place. None of them thought there was any reason to. The house sat quiet when he pulled in, the porch light already burned out and never replaced because there was no one left to complain about the dark. He carried the crate inside like a man carrying something wounded, both arms under it, careful of the tilt, careful of the way the straw shifted and settled. He set it on the kitchen table, the same table where he used to eat breakfast across from someone who wasn't there anymore, and for a moment he just stood looking at it in the weak yellow light of the overhead bulb. Then he pulled the lamp closer, the old gooseneck one with the cracked shade, and began. He lifted each egg out one at a time, cradling it in a palm that had gone thick and calloused from decades of work, and held it up to the light the way he'd once held a rifle bolt to check for wear, the way he'd checked gauges and dials on long nights when sleep wasn't allowed and attention was the only thing standing between quiet and disaster. He turned each egg slow, studying the hairline fractures, some barely visible, some running like river forks across the shell. He held them to his ear, though he couldn't have said what he expected to hear. He held them to the lamp and watched the light bleed through, faint and orange, searching for the small, dark shape inside that would tell him there was still something alive in there fighting to become more than a crack. Most of them told him nothing certain. A few felt wrong in his hand, too light, too still, and those he set aside gently, without ceremony, the way you set aside a tool you know won't serve its purpose, but don't have the heart to throw away just yet. Others gave him a flicker of hope, a faint, shifting weight, a shadow that moved when he tilted them toward the light, something that made the old discipline in him straighten his spine a little. He worked through the whole crate that way, egg by egg, for the better part of an hour, writing nothing down yet, just learning the shapes of them, the weight of them, memorizing which ones deserved the chance and which ones likely didn't. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling under his boots. Outside, the wind picked up against the window glass, carrying the cold in from the fields. He didn't decide right away how many he'd try to save. That wasn't how he worked. He'd learned long ago, in places far harder than this kitchen, that decisions made too fast in the dark were often decisions you regretted at dawn. So he set the eggs in a shallow box lined with an old towel, arranged them by his own private judgment of hope and doubt, and sat back in his chair to think about what kind of home he could build for something that fragile. Morning came gray and slow, the kind of light that didn't so much rise as seep into the sky, and he was already out in the barn before it fully arrived. He'd slept maybe 3 hours, sitting up part of the night with the box of eggs beside his bed, like a man keeping watch over something wounded. Now he stood in the cold barn with his breath fogging in front of him, looking at the scraps and cast-offs he'd accumulated over the years the way another man might look at tools laid out for surgery. There was a stack of plywood behind the old stalls, offcuts from when he'd patched the hayloft floor 2 summers back, warped a little at the edges but sound enough. He measured it with a carpenter's pencil stub and cut it down with a handsaw that had belonged to his father, the blade worn thin from decades of sharpening. He built the box slow, the way he did everything now, fitting corners tight, testing the joints with his palm before he trusted them, the old habit of checking twice what another man would check once. For heat, he'd remembered the coil from the oven that had died on him 2 winters ago, the one he'd never hauled to the dump because something in him never hauled anything to the dump if there was still a chance it could work again. He'd kept it in a coffee can of spare parts in the shed, along with the oven's old thermometer, its glass face cracked but its needle still true, when he tested it against a pot of boiling water on the stove. He wired the coil into the base of the box with the same patient hands that had once spliced field telephone lines in the dark, checking each connection twice, wrapping each joint with electrical tape until it looked clean and safe. The wool blanket came last. It had been his wife's, folded at the bottom of a cedar chest for longer than he cared to count, moth-eaten in one corner but still thick and warm. He hesitated over it longer than he had over anything else in the barn, his hand resting on the fabric a moment before he lifted it out and cut it into a lining for the box. It felt like giving something away, and also like giving something a second life, and he told himself both were true at once. By mid-afternoon, the box sat finished in the corner of the barn nearest the wood stove, wired, lined, and waiting, the thermometer propped where he could read it without disturbing the eggs. He knelt beside it a long while, adjusting the coil's distance from the towel-lined nest inside, testing the warmth against the back of his hand the way a mother might test a bottle, before he finally went inside to bring the eggs out to their new home. The eggs came out wrapped in a dish towel, carried against his chest the way he might have carried something wounded, and he set them one by one into the nest of wool, turning each so the air cell faced upward before he let go. 28 in all, cracked and hairline fractured, some so faint the fracture only showed when the barn light caught them at an angle. He counted them twice before he closed the lid, then found an old notebook in the kitchen drawer, its cover soft with handling, and tore out the pages that held a decade of feed costs and weather notes until he reached a clean one. At the top of that page he wrote the date, and beneath it, in the same blocky hand he'd once used to log radio frequencies and watch times, he wrote Batch 1, 28 eggs, temperature 99.5. From that morning on, the barn kept a new kind of clock. He turned the eggs by hand 3 times a day, at intervals as fixed as any watch schedule he'd ever stood, marking each turn in the notebook with a small tick and the hour beside it. He did not trust memory alone, though his memory was good. He trusted the paper, because paper did not lie to a tired man in the way his own certainty sometimes could. Each turn was slow and deliberate, rolling the egg a quarter turn between his fingers, feeling for warmth, for the faint give of a shell gone soft in the wrong way, for anything that might tell him a good egg had quietly gone bad in the night. He checked the thermometer before he touched a single egg, and again after, writing both numbers down even when they matched, because a man who only wrote down the surprises missed the pattern building underneath them. The wood stove needed tending too, and he split kindling smaller than he used for the house, so the barn's warmth came steady instead of surging, checking the coil's glow through a crack in the box more times a day than he'd admit to anyone at the feed store. At night, he woke on his own, without an alarm, the way he'd woken for decades of watches that no longer existed, and he'd cross the yard in the dark with a lantern to check the temperature one more time before he let himself sleep again. The notebook filled steadily, day after day, temperature and turn and the occasional note, one shell sweating corrected draft, until the pages took on the rhythm of a man keeping careful record of something he refused to let slip past him unnoticed. He never once mentioned the notebook to anyone in town, and no one asked, because by then the crate of cracked eggs had already slipped from most minds entirely, filed away as one more strange thing the old man had done and would likely regret. The fairgrounds worker paused there, letting the memory settle like dust after a truck passes, and the young visitor beside him shifted his weight against the fence rail, waiting for more. That was the part of the story, he said, that nobody else got to see. The weeks where nothing seemed to happen at all, where the town had already moved past the whole business and gone back to worrying about frost dates and feed prices and whatever else filled the days of people who didn't have a crate of cracked eggs waiting in a scrapwood box. The feed store crowd stopped bringing it up. Even the clerk who'd laughed loudest found other things to needle folks about. Life in a small county has a short memory for anything that isn't actively embarrassing someone in the moment, and the old man's foolish errand had already curdled into old news. But out at the farm, nothing about those weeks was quiet in the way the town assumed. The cold snapped harder some nights than others, and he learned to read the wind before he read the thermometer, because a gust finding its way through a gap in the barn boards could undo an hour of careful heat faster than the coil could give it back. He patched those gaps with rags and old feed sacking, stuffing them tight, then stood back to watch the lantern flame for any flicker that meant a draft was still sneaking through. The wool blanket he'd draped over the box he adjusted by fractions, pulled back an inch when the coil ran warm, tucked snug when a hard freeze pressed against the windows. He came to know that box the way he'd once known a rifle stripped down on a poncho in the dark, every part familiar under his hands even without light to see it. There were nights the wind howled loud enough to wake the dogs 3 farms over, and he'd stand in the barn doorway in his coat, watching his breath cloud in the lantern light, listening to the coil hum low and steady like something alive. He never let himself believe the eggs were safe just because a day had passed without disaster. Complacency, he'd learned long ago, was how a man lost the thing he was supposed to be guarding. So he kept checking, kept adjusting, kept writing down numbers in a hand that grew steadier with practice, even as his knees complained louder in the cold. The town, meanwhile, had entirely forgotten to wonder whether anything was happening at all inside that barn, which suited him fine, because a man used to being overlooked had long since stopped needing anyone's attention to keep doing the thing that mattered. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and unremarkable, when he heard the first sound that didn't belong to wind or coil or barn timber settling in the cold. A tapping, small, patient, coming from beneath the wool blanket like a knuckle against a door. He knelt slow, the way his knees demanded now, and lifted the corner of cloth with 2 fingers, careful as a man diffusing something he didn't fully trust yet. The shell had gone from hairline crack to something wider, a jagged seam pulling apart under pressure from within. He didn't touch it. He'd read enough, remembered enough, from a lifetime of watching things fight their own way into being, to know that a hand too eager could undo what patience had built. So he sat back on an overturned bucket and watched, the lantern throwing gold across his weathered face, and he waited the way he'd waited through longer nights than this one. By noon, the first duckling broke free. Wet, exhausted, impossibly small, its down plastered flat against a body that trembled with the effort of simply existing. He didn't cheer. He didn't call out to anyone, because there was no one left who cared to hear it. He only wrote the time in his notebook, steady letters despite the tremble starting in his own hands, and set a dry towel beneath the heat lamp for what would come next. What came next surprised even him. Over the following 2 days, shell after shell gave way, some slow and reluctant, some sudden and violent, as if the duckling inside had simply run out of patience with the world holding it back. He counted each one against the log he'd kept faithfully for weeks, matching hatch to number, number to crack pattern, the record complete the way a good watch report should be. 13. Out of the original batch, 13 survived the breaking, cracked shells and all, damaged from the start and hatching anyway, as if the very fracture that should have killed them had instead taught something stubborn into their blood. He'd seen weak things before, in men and animals both, and knew the difference between fragile and merely bent. These were bent. They stood on legs still unsteady and lifted their heads toward the lamp's warmth with an alertness that unsettled him a little, that made him sit back on the bucket and simply look at them for a long while. He didn't know yet what it meant, not fully, only that something in the damage itself, the very flaw the hatchery had condemned them for, seemed to have forged them harder rather than breaking them apart. He thought of scars healed over tougher than the skin around them, and said nothing to the empty barn, only reached for the thermometer to check the coil once more, because 13 small lives depending on a stranger's steady hands was not the kind of thing a man allowed himself to celebrate before the work was finished. The winter that followed tested every animal on the place, and it was the ducks he watched closest. He moved them from the scrap wood box to a pen built from salvaged fencing and a lean-to roof patched with tin, banking straw against the north wall the way he'd once banked snow against a foxhole for warmth rather than glory. The cold came hard that January, the kind that cracked water troughs and sent even seasoned stock into shivering huddles, and he waited for sickness the way he'd once waited for weather to turn on an exposed position, expecting the worst, keeping his rifle of remedies close at hand. It never came. The 13 grew through the frost with a steadiness that unsettled him again, the same way their hatching had. Where his few chickens hunched and sulked near the stove, the ducks paddled out to the frozen edge of the pond he'd cleared for them, dipping and shaking off the cold like it was nothing more than a passing rain. He kept the notebook going, though the entries changed in character, no longer counts of survival but observations of behavior, weight, feather condition, the way they took to the water even when ice crusted its rim. When 2 of the hens began laying by spring, and their own eggs hatched clean and easy, 7 more healthy ducklings joining the flock, he watched those newest arrivals with the same unblinking attention, waiting to see if the toughness had only belonged to the original 13, or if it had passed down like an inheritance. It had. The second generation shrugged off the wet chill of March mud, the way their parents had shrugged off January's ice, and none sickened, and none died, though he'd lost lambs and even a calf to lesser cold in years past. He told almost no one, not out of secrecy exactly, more the old habit of a man who'd learned that words spent too early could undo what patience had built. When the feed store clerk asked in passing how that pity crate had turned out, Walt said only that the ducks were doing fine, thank you, and let the man's attention wander back to the radio and the auction listings. He didn't mention the hardiness, didn't mention the notebook full of numbers that no one else would have bothered keeping. He simply kept doing the morning walk to the pond, breaking whatever skin of ice had formed overnight, scattering feed, checking each bird's eyes and feathers with the discipline of an inspection he'd run 1,000 times on canvas cots and rusted rifles instead of feathered backs. The town, as towns do, forgot. The crate became an old joke, retold less and less, then not at all. But out behind Walt Denning's leaning barn, generation was answering generation, and something durable was quietly multiplying under a coat of ordinary feathers, waiting for a day at the fairgrounds nobody yet knew to expect. The fairgrounds that year smelled the way they always did in late summer, fried dough and diesel exhaust, sawdust and animal sweat, the tinny sound of a loudspeaker testing itself over the cattle barns. He drove in before sunrise, same as he'd driven in every year for longer than most folks could remember. The old Ford idling low and rough as it crossed the cattle guard, the crate in the bed replaced now by 2 wire pens he'd built himself from scrap fencing and baling wire, each one holding a dozen ducks that moved with the calm, unbothered confidence of birds who had never once been sickly. The man at the gate, checking entries against a clipboard, looked up when Walt backed the truck toward the poultry tent. He looked twice, actually, because the birds in those pens weren't the thin, patchy things you usually saw from small backyard flocks. They had weight to them, a shine in the feathers, eyes clear and alert, none of the huddling or listlessness that marked a flock that had been fighting off something all winter. Word moved through the tent the way it always did at a fair, quiet at first, then louder, until people were drifting over from the goat pens and the vegetable tables just to look. The auctioneer was there, same one who'd laughed loudest at the feed store years back, standing now with his hands in his pockets, saying nothing, studying the pens with the careful attention of a man recalculating something in his head. A few of the younger farmers came by too, the ones who'd once leaned against their trucks trading jokes about a crazy old man and his box of broken eggs. None of them were laughing now. One of them crouched down at the wire, watching a duck preen itself, and asked, almost reluctantly, where Walt had gotten stock like that. Walt didn't say much. He never did. He answered the judge's questions when they came around with their clipboards, calm and plain, the way he might have answered an officer's questions once, giving only what was asked and nothing more. But when the ribbons were handed out that afternoon, blue for condition, another for the pair judged healthiest breeding stock in the whole poultry building, the tent went quiet in a different way than it had years before. Not mocking quiet, stunned quiet. He stood there in his same old jacket, hat pushed back, ribbons pinned along the top rail of the pen, looking for all the world like a man who'd expected nothing else. Somewhere near the back of the gathering crowd, a woman in a hatchery jacket had stopped walking altogether, her clipboard lowered, her eyes fixed on the birds, like she was doing arithmetic she didn't want to be doing, arithmetic that had everything to do with the trouble waiting back at her own hatchery pens. She came around the front of the pen slow, the way you'd approach a horse you weren't sure of, and for a long moment she just stood there looking at the ducks instead of the man. The fairgrounds worker telling all this remembered it clear as anything, because it was the first time he'd ever seen her not moving fast, not talking fast, not scribbling something on that clipboard she carried everywhere like it was part of her arm. She had a hatchery of her own to run, and that spring it had been nothing but trouble, a wet sickness moving through her breeding stock, birds going soft and dying in the pens no matter what she dosed the water with, whole clutches of eggs coming out weak-shelled and doomed before they ever pipped. She'd driven half the county looking for stock that might hold up, and here it was, wearing ribbons, standing in a rickety pen that a poor old widower farmer had built out of chicken wire and stubbornness. She asked him again, quieter this time, where the birds had come from, though she already knew. He looked at her a moment before he answered, and there wasn't any triumph in his face, no settling of an old score, just the same plain patience he'd carried the whole time. He told her they came from a crate of cracked eggs she'd handed him years back at the feed store, the ones bound for the trash if nobody wanted them. She didn't say anything to that. What was there to say? She just stood with her clipboard hanging loose at her side and watched the ducks a while longer, doing the arithmetic the boy had noticed from a distance. Sickness in her flocks, orders she couldn't fill, buyers who'd stopped trusting her hatchery altogether if the spring hatch failed twice running. It took her the better part of an hour to work up to asking him plain. She wanted breeding pairs. She'd pay fair, she said. More than fair, whatever the going rate was, and then some, because she needed birds that could stand up to what was moving through the county that year, and there wasn't another flock within 100 miles that looked like his. He didn't answer right off. He never did anything right off. He looked at his ducks a long moment, the ones he'd turned by hand in a scrap-wood box through the cold nights of that first winter, and there was something in his face that wasn't pride exactly, more like a man deciding how much of a hard-won thing he was willing to part with, and to who. The crowd that had gathered again by then had gone dead silent, waiting to see what the old man who'd been laughed out of the feed store not so long ago would say to the woman who'd once handed him her trash. He wrote her a check that day, and every spring after that, another one followed, same as clockwork, same as the geese coming back to the pond behind the barn. That's how it started between them. Not friendship exactly, the old man said, but respect, which in that country was worth more. The fairgrounds worker paused there, looking out over the duck pens, the wire gone soft with rust in places, patched here and there with newer mesh that didn't quite match the old. The young visitor beside him hadn't said a word in a long while, just watched the ducks paddle slow circles in the trough water, waiting. "She still comes around every spring," he said. "Older now, slower, but she still drives out to that farm same as always, and she still buys her breeding stock from the same family. Been that way going on. Well, longer than you've been alive, I'd guess. The boy asked if the old man was still out there. No, the worker said, and something in his voice softened the way it does when a man's talking about someone he loved and lost long enough ago that the grief's turned into something quieter, something closer to gratitude. He's been gone some years now, but his grandson runs the place. Good hand with animals, just like his grandfather was, and you know what he keeps out in that shed, right next to the tractor? The boy shook his head. That same box, same scrap wood, same wire coil patched over twice now, same thermometer taped up with electrical tape where the glass cracked once. Grandson fixed it up himself a few years back rather than buy a new one, said there wasn't a store-bought incubator built that could do what that old box had already proven it could do. He shook his head, smiling faintly. Some things you don't throw out just because they're old. Some things you keep because of what they already showed you they could do. He looked down at the boy, who was still watching the ducks, and for a moment the fairgrounds worker was 10 years old again himself, standing in the mud beside his father's stall, watching an old veteran farmer nobody thought much of walk his flock past a hatchery manager who'd once thrown that flock's whole existence in the trash. Folks around here still tell it different ways, he said. Some say it was luck, some say it was stubbornness. I say it was patience, the kind you don't get from a book, the kind a man learns standing watch through nights nobody else wanted to stand. He didn't see broken eggs in that crate. He saw what nobody else was willing to look for. He nodded toward the pens, the ducks settling now in the late afternoon light, feathers catching gold along their backs. Whole county's better for it, he said, and it started with a crate of eggs everybody figured belonged in the dump.